The stars themselves seemed to weep that night. Fading embers of distant suns scattered across the void, as though the galaxy mourned a sorrow too vast for any single soul to bear. In the remnants of Cadia, the fortress world that had once stood as a bulwark against the tides of the warp, silence hung heavy, a silence punctuated only by the echo of crumbling battlements and the distant, hollow thrum of warp energies seeping through ruptured void shields. Time itself felt suspended, caught between the agony of what had been and the uncertainty of what might remain. Yet, even amidst this cosmic desolation, there was a heartbeat, a pulse of life, fragile and defiant, struggling to endure against the inexorable weight of entropy. Before we begin the story, let us truly say, we love and care for you, and we want you to feel a part of this tale, as if you too are adrift among the stars, bearing witness to the unfolding tragedy. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, grab your coffee, your tea, or whatever comforts you in the darkness, and let us journey together into the shadow of Cadia's fall. High above the shattered plains of the planet, the remnants of the Cadian Gate Station flickered against the void like a dying heartbeat. From this vantage, one could see the scars etched across the landscape, deep canyons carved by the relentless assault of orbiting artillery and the insidious corruption of the warp. Here, the remnants of humanity's finest soldiers had once held the line, standing as the galaxy's final bulwark against chaos incarnate. But now, even the bravest heart seemed frail, shadows of themselves bending beneath the crushing inevitability of defeat. At the center of this ruin, standing upon the highest battlement, was Commander Valerius Kyle. His armor, once a gleaming testament to Cadian engineering, was now scorched, dented, and streaked with the soot of war. The sigils of loyalty etched into his pauldrons were tarnished by smoke and ash, but he bore them still, as though their symbolism alone could anchor him to a sense of purpose. His gaze swept across the desolation below, lingering on the remnants of his regiments, scattered and broken. Each life lost was a fissure in his soul, each cry of the dying a reminder that no fortress, no matter how strong, could stand forever against the tides of chaos. Valerius was not a man untested by war, yet the weight of immortality, or what passed for it in the endless cycles of service to the Emperor, pressed heavily upon him now. He had seen empires rise and fall, worlds burn and rebuild, and yet the inevitability of decay had never felt so personal. A question gnawed at him, insidious and unrelenting. If the cost of survival was endless sacrifice and inevitable loss, then what truly was the meaning of victory? The wind tore across the battlements, carrying with it the scent of ozone, blood, and the acrid tang of molten stone. Valerius closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the cadence of his soldiers' drills, the resonance of hope in their voices, now silenced. His mind drifted to the council chambers, where whispers of betrayal had begun long before the first shots of the siege fell. There had been promises, alliances forged in fire and mutual respect, yet all had faltered in the face of fear. Some had fled, some had fallen to treachery, and some had been seduced by the seductive whispers of the warp. And yet, even amidst this despair, Valerius clung to a fragile ember of hope. He remembered the faces of his closest companions, Captain Darius, whose loyalty had never wavered, Secutor Livia, whose counsel had steered him through countless crises, and the mysterious envoy from the Mechanicum, whose intentions remained obscured beneath layers of protocol and secrecy. These were the threads that remained in the tapestry of his command, threads that could either bind him to salvation or unravel him completely. As the first tremors of an approaching warp storm shook the ground beneath his feet, Valerius made a silent vow. He would not allow Cadia to fall without a fight, not because of glory, not because of duty, but because even in a galaxy drenched in blood and betrayal, he still believed in the faint, stubborn glimmer of what was right. Yet in the shadows, far from the eyes of the weary commander, something watched. A presence older than the stars, patient and relentless, feeding upon the fractures of loyalty and the fragility of hope. It had whispered into the ears of generals, sown doubt in the hearts of leaders, and now it lingered at the periphery of Valerius's vision, an unseen hand guiding the fates of men and empires alike. The true enemy was not merely the horde battering Cadia's gates. It was the slow erosion of trust, the betrayal of ideals, and the quiet, creeping despair that festered in every corner of the soul. And so, beneath the dying light of a sun that had burned for eons, Commander Valerius Kyle faced the first of many impossible choices. The echoes of the past pressed upon him. The demands of the present weighed heavily, and the uncertainty of the future loomed like a spectre upon the horizon. The fate of Cadia, and perhaps the galaxy itself, hung in a delicate balance, tethered to the courage, the wisdom, and the inevitable fallibility of one man. In that stillness, he whispered to the wind, a vow both personal and universal. He would endure, he would fight, and he would confront whatever horrors the universe had yet to unleash. Yet even as the words left his lips, a tremor ran through the air, a warning that no resolve, no matter how ironclad, could shield one from the inexorable tide of fate. The war to come would test not only the strength of arms, but the fortitude of the soul, and in the shadows of Cadia's ruins, the first act of this tragedy had only just begun. The morning after the siege's first onslaught brought no relief, only a heavy, suffocating quiet. The winds that swept across Cadia's shattered plains carried ash and the acrid scent of burning promethium, coating the remnants of fortifications in a grey haze. Commander Valerius Kyle moved among the survivors, his boots crunching against the brittle remnants of what had once been proud battalions. Each step reminded him of lives lost and promises broken, each breath a reminder that time was no ally, but a relentless arbiter of decay. In the distance, the warped horizon hinted at something unnatural, a storm in the immaterium gathering strength, as though the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of fate. Captain Darius walked beside him, silent yet vigilant. His presence was a small comfort, a reminder that even in ruin, there were those whose loyalty remained unsullied. Yet the lines around Darius's eyes betrayed a mind burdened by the same doubts that gnawed at Valerius. "They've taken the lower bastions," Darius said quietly, voice like the grinding of stone. "We can hold the high walls, but the enemy's numbers grow every cycle. The warp is feeding them. It's almost alive." Valerius did not respond immediately. He felt the tremor beneath his feet, the subtle pulse of the warp bleeding into the real world. For centuries, he had fought wars of men and Xenos alike. Yet this intangible enemy, was different. It required more than strategy. It demanded the understanding of fear itself. And he could not claim to understand fear anymore, not fully, not after seeing thousands fall for ideals that had begun to crumble even in the hearts of the living. They entered the command chamber, a cavernous room where once the roar of strategy and disciplined orders had echoed. Now it was a mausoleum of paper, maps scorched and curling, hololithic screens flickering like dying fireflies. Secuta Livia awaited them, her robe singed, her eyes sharp with the weight of unspoken truths. "The council is fractured," she said. "Some want to retreat, some want to strike blind, and then there are whispers that the envoy from the Mechanicum may not be what he appears." Valerius's jaw tightened. The Mechanicum envoy, a figure draped in the austere regalia of Mars, had always been enigmatic. Their intentions were often veiled in ritual and protocol, but Livia's words carried a resonance he could not ignore. Betrayal, he realized, had 1,000 forms, and in a galaxy teetering on the brink, it could wear the face of an ally as easily as an enemy. Darius broke the silence. "What do we do? If the envoy is not as loyal as we believed, then Cadia itself could fall not to the enemy outside, but to the enemy within." His voice was measured, but the tension underneath was clear. Valerius looked out through the fractured viewport, his gaze lingering on the distant horizon where dark clouds twisted unnaturally, as if the warp itself were a predator circling the world. "It begins with understanding what we fight for," Valerius said at last. "Not for glory, not for empty vows, but for the lives that remain. Every soldier, every civilian who survives this day depends on clarity of purpose. And if betrayal lurks in our midst, we must uncover it before it consumes us from the inside." A subtle silence fell, heavy with the unspoken. Even those loyal to the Emperor's cause could falter when faced with the weight of infinite responsibility. Immortality, or the semblance of it, was not a gift, he reflected, but a curse. To live beyond ordinary spans, to bear witness to the rise and fall of empires, sharpened the mind but hollowed the heart. And as the commander watched his companions, he knew that each choice he made would echo far beyond this world, perhaps across countless systems and generations. As the hours passed, emissaries arrived bearing urgent reports. Outposts on the outer sectors had been breached. Communication arrays were failing. Some soldiers whispered of spectral figures, shadows moving against the storm, voices not of this reality. Cadia, the eternal fortress, was beginning to unravel, thread by delicate thread. And yet, amidst this mounting chaos, small acts of courage glimmered. A sergeant shielding refugees with his own body, a medic refusing to abandon the wounded, a scout returning with vital intelligence that might yet turn the tide. Valerius felt the duality of existence press upon him, the horror of loss and the stubborn defiance of hope. He wandered the command chamber, tracing his fingers over the cold, scorched maps, each one representing a world or system that could slip into oblivion if he faltered. And in that moment, he understood something profound. Leadership was not merely the wielding of power, but the endurance of impossible burdens, the making of decisions that would haunt one's conscience for eternity. Secutor Livia approached him then, her voice soft but unwavering. "There are those who will fall to the whispers of the warp," she said, "but there are also those who will rise. The galaxy is not yet lost, if we act with both caution and courage." Her eyes met his, sharp and penetrating. "You are that fulcrum, Valerius. Whether Cadia survives or perishes may hinge on the choices you make this very cycle." Valerius closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. The wind outside howled, carrying the first hints of an approaching warp tempest that would test not only the strength of arms, but the resilience of the mind. And he thought of the envoy from the Mechanicum, of Captain Darius, of Secutor Livia, and of countless others whose fates were entwined with his own. Every ally could be a traitor. Every act of loyalty could be a deception. the lines between friend and foe blurred, until only one truth remained. Survival demanded vigilance, and hope demanded sacrifice. That night, as Cadia trembled beneath the encroaching shadow, Valerius ascended once more to the highest battlement. The stars above were dimmed by smoke and ash, but the pulse of the universe remained, a rhythm that whispered both warning and possibility. Somewhere in that infinite expanse, a choice awaited him, a choice that would define not just the fate of this embattled world, but perhaps the trajectory of entire civilizations. And as the warp storm finally broke, sending tendrils of energy flickering across the horizon like the fingers of a dark god, Valerius whispered a silent oath. He would endure. He would discern the traitors hidden among them, and he would fight for Cadia, no matter the cost, even if the price was his own soul. The warp storm raged through the void like a living tempest, its twisting energies lashing at the walls of Cadia, shivering the very foundations of the fortress world. Commander Valerius Cale moved with careful deliberation among the remaining officers, his senses sharpened by the relentless tension that had settled over the planet. Each report brought new horrors. Outlying garrisons had been consumed, communication relays silenced, and entire regiments vanished under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Yet the true weight of the threat was not merely physical. It was a corrosive presence that gnawed at the trust and cohesion of those who remained. Captain Darius approached, his expression etched with concern. "Some of the men, they claim to hear voices," he said quietly, almost reluctantly, as though fear itself made his tongue heavy. "Whispers that promise safety, power, release from the fight. They are faltering, Valerius. Their loyalty. We cannot be certain." Valerius nodded, his eyes dark pools of resolve and worry. He had seen men fall to despair before, but this was different. This was subtle, invasive, a corrosion of the soul itself. The whispers were not of this world. They came from the warp, feeding on doubt and pain, shaping reality to their desires. And worse, they thrived on the cracks left by human emotion, fear, anger, and the quiet longing for survival at any cost. He turned his attention to Secutor Livia, who had been examining the hololithic displays that charted troop movements and warp activity across the planet. "We cannot fight them as we fight mortals," she said. "The enemy is everywhere and nowhere, a shadow on the mind as much as the body. We must anchor ourselves, hold the men's spirits, or Cadia will fall from within before the armies of chaos even breach the gates." Valerius felt the weight of her words. Command had never been a matter of strategy alone. It had always been a test of heart, mind, and will. He thought of the Mechanicum envoy, still a shadow in the periphery of his awareness, their intentions as inscrutable as the warp storms themselves. Were they ally? Were they agent of betrayal? Or were they something far older, orchestrating events beyond comprehension? He could not know, and yet he had to act as if he did. The night was long, broken only by the distant roars of artillery and the unnatural howl of the storm. Valerius walked along the high ramparts, observing the men and women who clung to their post. Among them, he saw the flicker of fear, yes, but also defiance. There were those who would stand, even in the shadow of death, simply because they had no other choice. It was a fragile hope, but hope, in his experience, was often the difference between survival and despair. A sudden tremor shook the fortress, throwing dust and debris into the air. Soldiers stumbled, alarm bells clanged. Valerius gripped the edge of the battlement, peering into the distance where the warp storm met the horizon. There, in the flickering light of a fractured sun, he glimpsed figures moving with purpose and speed, silhouettes that were neither fully human nor entirely alien. His stomach tightened. The enemy was not waiting. They were advancing, relentless and patient. Later, in the council chamber, Valerius convened a meeting of his closest advisors. The room was filled with tension, each officer acutely aware that their words could sway the fragile morale of the survivors. Livia spoke first, her voice measured but urgent. "We must identify the weak links, those who cannot resist the whispers, those whose loyalty wavers. They jeopardize all of us. The enemy does not need to kill if it can destroy our unity from within." Darius nodded. And yet, rooting out potential traitors before they act, that risks alienating those who remain loyal. How do we discern intent from fear? His question hung in the air, unanswered, a mirror of the uncertainty gripping the entire planet. Valerius leaned forward, eyes fixed on the maps projected in the dim light. "We act carefully, but decisively. Every choice we make will echo through the lives of the men and women we command. We cannot afford hesitation, yet we cannot afford cruelty. And above all, we must recognize that sometimes the gravest betrayal comes not from the enemy outside, but from the doubts we allow to fester inside ourselves." The council fell silent, each member wrestling with the weight of their leader's words. In that silence, the air seemed to thrum with expectation, as if the fortress itself awaited the first move in a game whose rules were written in shadows and fire. Hours passed. Orders were dispatched. Reconnaissance teams were sent to the outer perimeters, while the remaining garrison focused on reinforcing critical positions. Valerius observed them, his mind a tempest of worry and calculation. He had lived through countless wars, yet nothing had prepared him for the corrosive threat of uncertainty, the slow erosion of trust among those who should be steadfast. In the solitude of his quarters, Valerius allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the countless battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, and the victories that had always carried the bitter aftertaste of human cost. Immortality, or its semblance, was not a shield against grief. It was merely a prolonged exposure to it, magnified and sharpened with each passing cycle. He wondered, as he often did in these quiet, dangerous hours, whether the sacrifices demanded by duty were ever truly justified. Was the preservation of Cadia worth the lives of thousands, tens of thousands or more? And if he chose wrongly, if one decision led to ruin, would the weight of that choice follow him into eternity? A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Livia, her presence a calm contrast to the storm outside. "You cannot carry this alone," she said. "None of us can. The enemy will exploit any fracture, any hesitation. But we endure. Together. You are not alone, Valerius. Not yet." He nodded, appreciating the comfort of her words, though the uncertainty remained. The galaxy was vast, cruel, and indifferent, yet here, in the ruins of Cadia, they had found a spark of resolve, and sometimes he knew a single spark could ignite the will of an entire planet. As the hours slipped toward dawn, Valerius stood once more on the battlements. The warp storm still churned, dark tendrils twisting across the sky like serpents of shadow. Yet in its turbulence, he glimpsed possibility. The battle for Cadia was far from over, and the choices he would make in the cycles to come would shape not only the fate of the planet, but the destiny of countless lives across the stars. And so, beneath the flickering light of a dying sun, Valerius Kyle steeled himself. The enemy was relentless, the whispers were insidious, the shadow of betrayal loomed ever closer. Yet in the stillness, He resolved that Cadia would endure. He would endure. And in the face of despair, they would fight. Not because victory was certain, but because the act of defiance, however small, was itself a declaration of existence against the darkness. The days bled into one another, each indistinguishable from the last, yet each heavier than the one before. Cadia's skies, once vibrant with the light of distant suns and the disciplined hum of orbital defenses, were now choked with ash and warp-twisted clouds. Commander Valerius Kyle moved through the fortress like a ghost among the living, each step echoing in corridors scarred by battle. The fortress was alive with whispers, both real and imagined, an incessant reminder that the world they had known was gone, replaced by one in which trust and certainty were luxuries they could no longer afford. Captain Darius joined him at the edge of the inner perimeter, where remnants of artillery formations struggled to maintain their footing against the ever-encroaching storm. "The men are fracturing," Darius said, voice low, yet carrying the weight of inevitability. "Some speak of visions, of armies that do not exist, of allies who are enemies in disguise. The warp is playing with them, with us." Valerius did not immediately respond. He had heard these reports before, seen similar phenomena on worlds consumed by the immaterium. Yet the insidiousness of this particular threat gnawed at him. It was no longer a matter of firepower or strategy. It was a question of perception, of morality, of the fragile human mind under pressure. How could one lead when every shadow carried the possibility of betrayal, and every voice might be the whisper of something older than the stars themselves? Secutor Livia approached from the command chamber, her robes dusted with ash. "I've been reviewing the intelligence reports," she said, her voice steady, yet tinged with unease. "There are anomalies. Outposts that reported complete devastation, yet no enemy forces were recorded. Others claim to have encountered spectres of their own comrades, urging them to surrender, to betray the line. These are not illusions born of fear alone. Something alive in the warp is shaping perception itself." Valerius's eyes darkened. He had expected enemies in the flesh, in the fire and steel of conventional war. But this was a war of the mind, a battle against shadows that could twist loyalty and fracture bonds of trust. He realized that victory might not be measured in territory or body count, but in the strength of will, the endurance of hope amidst the crushing inevitability of despair. Hours later, in the dim glow of the war room, he convened the senior officers. The tension was palpable. Each face bore the lines of exhaustion and worry, shadows etched by sleepless nights and relentless fear. The Mechanicum envoy, silent and inscrutable, observed from a corner, his motives concealed beneath layers of ritual and protocol. "We cannot fight what we cannot see," Valerius began, his voice calm but resolute. "The enemy thrives on doubt. It feeds on our hesitation, our fear, but it cannot claim what we hold in our hearts. We must remain vigilant, not only with weapons but with minds and souls. We will discern the truth of friend and foe alike, and we will act decisively." Darius leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "And if we are wrong," he asked, "if in rooting out traitors, we destroy those who remain loyal? Morale is fragile. One misstep could doom us all." Valerius's gaze swept over the council. "Then we act with clarity, with discernment, and with the understanding that every choice carries consequence. We may falter, we may lose, but inaction is certain death. Cadia survives through courage, through perseverance, and through the unyielding will of those who refuse to bow to the darkness, no matter how insidious it may be. The hours stretched on. Orders were dispatched to reinforce key sectors, to investigate anomalies, and to maintain cohesion among the scattered regiments. Even as Valerius moved through the fortress, he felt the duality of existence pressing upon him, the fragility of life, the weight of immortality, and the unrelenting presence of unseen forces. The whispers continued, subtle but persistent, threading through the minds of soldiers and leaders alike, each phrase a test of resolve, each suggestion a temptation toward despair. Late into the cycle, Valerius found a moment of solitude in the observation chamber. The horizon was a twisted panorama of smoke, ash, and the unnatural colors of the warp bleeding into reality. Stars flickered as if uncertain of their own existence. He reflected on the countless battles he had endured, the friends and companions lost, the victories that always carried the bitter taste of mortality and loss. Immortality, he understood, was not a gift of clarity, but a prolonged exposure to grief and regret. And yet, even in that reflection, he sensed a fragile thread of possibility. Small acts of defiance glimmered amidst the despair. A lieutenant rallying a unit despite injuries, a medic refusing to abandon the wounded, scouts returning with information that might yet turn the tide. It was these threads, however tenuous, that wove the fabric of hope. Secutor Livia joined him in silence, her presence a calm contrast to the storm. "We will face horrors that no mortal should endure," she said softly. "Yet the strength of will can bend even the warp's influence. Remember, Valerius, it is not only the enemies we see who threaten us. Sometimes the gravest danger comes from the doubts we carry within." Valerius nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle like stone upon his shoulders. The choices ahead would test every aspect of his being: loyalty, courage, morality, and endurance. He would have to confront not only the forces arrayed against Cadia, but the shadows within himself, the fears and regrets that had accumulated over millennia. As the first light of dawn broke through the smoke-choked skies, Valerius Kyle stood once more on the fortress ramparts. The horizon remained twisted, scarred by fire and shadow, yet he felt the pulse of the universe, subtle and persistent. In that rhythm, he discerned possibility, a fragile ember amidst the darkness. The battle for Cadia was far from over, and the choices he would make in the cycles to come would determine not only the fate of the planet, but the course of countless lives across the galaxy. And so, with the warp storm still raging beyond the horizon, and the whispers lingering like a constant threat, Valerius steeled himself for what lay ahead. The enemy was relentless, invisible, and patient. Yet in the stillness, he resolved that Cadia would endure. He would endure, and in the face of despair, they would fight. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because the act of defiance itself was a declaration against the darkness. The days grew heavier, each one folding into the next like the layers of ash that now coated Cadia's shattered plains. Commander Valerius Kyle walked among the remnants of the garrison, observing faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and stubborn defiance. Soldiers moved as though through a dream, their steps uncertain, their voices carrying the tremor of unease. The warp storm beyond the horizon continued its relentless dance, casting eerie shadows across ruined battlements and hollowed streets. It was a storm that did not merely threaten life, it threatened reason, unity, and the fragile bonds that held Cadia together. Captain Darius joined him near the outer ramparts, leaning against the scorched railing. "Some of the men refused to obey," he said quietly, his voice taut with tension. They speak of visions, friends who call them to surrender, to abandon their posts. Others have vanished entirely, leaving only whispers in their wake. Valerius's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the warp storm churned like a living maw, consuming light and bending the air around it. He understood that the battle ahead was not of bullets or bombs, but of perception, will, and spirit. The enemy was no longer merely flesh and machine. It was shadow, suggestion, and the insidious erosion of loyalty. "We must anchor them," he said finally. "Anchor them to something tangible, something real. If we lose the men to their own doubts, Cadia falls from within, and nothing else matters." Secutor Livia appeared at his side, robe streaked with soot and grime. "We've sent squads to investigate," she said. "But the warp is adaptive. Every time we think we understand its movements, it changes. It studies us, learns from our responses, and exploits the smallest hesitation. The whispers are only the beginning. The true test is in the choices each man makes when confronted with fear." Valerius nodded, feeling the gnawing weight of responsibility. He had spent centuries leading men, watching worlds burn and rise again. Yet never had the stakes felt so intimately personal. Immortality, which had once seemed a shield against despair, now felt like a lens through which every loss, every failure was magnified. He could endure, yes, but at what cost to those who could not? As the day waned, reports continued to pour in. Outposts on the far perimeters had been overrun, not by armies, but by spectres, illusions, and strange phenomena that defied all logic. Soldiers who had been steadfast now questioned their senses, doubted their orders, and even, at times, each other. The Mechanicum envoy moved through the halls with quiet purpose, observing, recording, speaking little, yet the weight of their presence hinted at designs and knowledge that remained beyond comprehension. In a council meeting convened deep within the fortress, Valerius addressed his closest advisors. The room was silent, save for the occasional hum of damaged machinery and the distant rumble of the warp storm. "We are being tested in ways we cannot yet fully understand," he began, voice steady, carrying both authority and exhaustion. "Our enemy is patient, insidious, and relentless, but they cannot claim what we hold in our hearts. We fight not only with weapons, but with conviction. Every choice matters, every hesitation is a doorway to ruin." Darius spoke then, the edge of worry sharpening his tone. "And if we fail," he asked, "if the men break before the enemy arrives, if fear and whispers turn loyalty to treachery?" Valerius's eyes, dark and resolute, swept across the chamber. "Then we endure. Even if the outcome is uncertain, we endure. There is honor in resistance, even in the face of inevitable loss. There is strength in defiance, even against an enemy older than the stars." As the council dispersed, Valerius remained behind, tracing his fingers across the scorched hololithic maps. Each mark represented a life, a unit, a world. Every decision he made would echo beyond the immediate cycle, shaping fates far beyond Cadia's ruined borders. He thought of the men and women who had placed their trust in him, whose loyalty he had nurtured through countless campaigns, and whose faith now trembled under the weight of forces unseen. Hours later, beneath the fractured light of Cadia's fading sun, Valerius ascended once more to the highest rampart. The winds carried ash, the acrid scent of promethium, and the faint, unnatural hum of warp energy. Somewhere in the churning storm beyond the horizon, the enemy gathered, not merely waiting, but studying, learning, shaping their strategy against both the body and the mind. And yet, in that moment, Valerius felt something rare and precious, a flicker of hope. Small acts of courage continued to shine through the darkness. A medic braving the streets to save the wounded, a unit rallying against impossible odds, scouts returning with intelligence that, though incomplete, offered a chance to act. It was not much, but in the galaxy's cruel calculus, even the smallest spark could ignite a chain of defiance. Secutor Livia joined him, her presence a calm anchor against the storm's chaos. "Do not forget," she said softly, "that we are not merely responding to events, we shape them. Every choice you make, Valerius, ripples outward. The enemy may be patient, but so are we. Our resolve, though tested, is not yet broken." Valerius exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The battle for Cadia would not be won by weapons alone, nor by courage alone, but by the endurance of those willing to confront the unknown, to resist despair, and to act in the face of uncertainty. The decisions to come would test every facet of his being. Loyalty, morality, strength, and the very essence of will itself. As the first night of the warp storm deepened, he whispered a vow to the ruins below. Cadia would endure. He would endure. And even in the face of betrayal, shadow, and despair, they would fight. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because the act of resistance, however small, was itself a declaration of existence against the encroaching darkness. The warp storm had not relented. If anything, it had grown more insistent, more cunning. Its tendrils coiled around Cadia like living serpents, brushing against the minds of the defenders, whispering promises of power, release, and safety in equal measure. Commander Valerius Kyle moved through the corridors of the fortress with a measured pace, each step a negotiation with the exhaustion and dread that threatened to consume both him and those who followed him. The air was thick with ash, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of fear, a reminder that Cadia was no longer merely a bastion of defense, but a crucible testing the resilience of body, mind, and spirit. Captain Darius approached from the outer watch, his expression unreadable beneath the grime and fatigue that had become permanent companions. "Some of the soldiers, they speak openly of surrender," he said quietly, each word heavy with unspoken concern. "Others accuse their comrades of treachery, of listening to voices only they can hear. The fabric of our command is fraying, Valerius. We cannot sustain this much longer without decisive action." Valerius nodded, feeling the gnawing weight of inevitability. "The enemy we face is no longer only beyond the walls," he said, voice low but resolute. "It is within us, within the doubt and fear that we cannot afford to ignore. Every hesitation, every whispered doubt, becomes a weapon against us. We will face it as we face all threats, with clarity, courage, and unyielding will." Secutor Livia appeared at his side, her robe streaked with soot and dust, her eyes reflecting both weariness and unshakable determination. "We've identified the sectors most affected by these visions," she said. "They are subtle, but insidious. Even the strongest minds are not immune. The enemy exploits trust and fear alike. It is not merely a question of who will fall, but when." Valerius's gaze lingered on the horizon beyond the shattered walls, where the warp storm writhed like a predator testing the limits of its prey. He understood now that this conflict was as much psychological as it was martial, and that leadership demanded more than strategy. It demanded endurance of the soul. Immortality had taught him to survive countless wars, but it had not prepared him for the corrosion of trust, the slow erosion of unity from within. Later, in the dimly lit council chamber, Valerius convened a meeting with his senior officers. The atmosphere was tense. Each face bore the marks of sleepless nights and relentless anxiety. The Mechanicum envoy observed silently, their intentions veiled beneath layers of ritual and inscrutable protocol. "We cannot allow doubt to dictate our actions," Valerius said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "We anchor ourselves to truth, to purpose, and to one another. The whispers, the illusions, the shadows, they cannot claim what resides in the heart of the faithful. We fight not only for survival, but for the preservation of what remains of our humanity and our honor." Darius interjected, voice taut, "And if we make a mistake, if in rooting out fear we fracture loyalty, if one wrong decision turns comrades into enemies?" Valerius's eyes, dark and unwavering, swept across the room. "Then we endure. Every choice carries risk. Every hesitation carries danger. But inaction is certainty of ruin. We act with precision, discernment, and courage. And even in the face of loss, we endure, because to do otherwise is to surrender Cadia to oblivion before the enemy even arrives." Hours passed. Orders were dispatched to fortify critical positions, reinforce wavering units, and investigate anomalies reported across the fortress. Soldiers moved with grim determination, knowing that the survival of their home, and perhaps countless others, depended not only on strength of arms, but on endurance of spirit. In the solitude of the observation deck, Valerius allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The horizon was a tapestry of ruin and unnatural light, the warp storm painting reality with colors that should not exist. Stars flickered uncertainly, as though questioning their own persistence. He thought of those who had fallen in the line of duty, those whose lives had been claimed by the enemy, and those who remained, weary but defiant. Immortality, he realized, was a witness to infinite cycles of loss, a prolonged exposure to grief that sharpened wisdom but hollowed the heart. Secutor Livia joined him, her presence a quiet solace. "Remember," she said softly, "that endurance is more than survival. It is action in the face of despair, clarity in the midst of chaos, and loyalty even when doubt tempts the mind. You bear the weight of this world not alone. Together, we may yet withstand the storm." Valerius exhaled slowly, letting the words settle. The challenges ahead would test every facet of his being, his judgment, his courage, and the very essence of his will. The whispers would continue, the shadows would grow, and the enemy would press relentlessly. Yet Cadia had not fallen, not yet, and he would not allow it to fall without exacting a price from those who threatened it, whether from outside or within. As the warp storm intensified, he took one final glance at the horizon, the ruined plains, and the scattered fires of resistance. In that moment, he made a silent vow. Cadia would endure. He would endure. And even in the face of betrayal, despair, and shadows that reached into the minds of men, they would fight, not for certainty of victory, but because the act of defiance itself was the truest measure of existence against the darkness. The horizon of Cadia burned with unnatural light, as if the dying suns themselves were caught in the clutches of the warp storm. Commander Valerius Kyle stood on the outer ramparts, the winds lashing against him, carrying ash and the bitter scent of destruction. The once pristine bastion now lay in jagged ruin, a testament to centuries of fortification, resilience, and the unyielding will of its defenders. Yet even in ruin, the fortress pulsed with defiance, and it was this defiance that Valerius clung to, even as the shadows of betrayal and despair stretched long across the land. Captain Darius approached, his boots scraping against the fractured stone. The outlying garrisons report sightings of figures, neither wholly mortal nor entirely of the warp, he said, his voice tight with tension. They appear in moments of vulnerability, speaking words that drive men to question their loyalty, to question themselves. Valerius did not flinch. He had expected the enemy to strike with weapons of steel, fire, and destruction. Yet this invasion of perception, this assault on the mind and spirit, was far more insidious. "We are in a war of endurance," he said slowly, voice carrying over the howling wind. "They seek not to destroy our bodies, but our cohesion, our trust, our very souls. And if we falter, even for an instant, Cadia falls, not to armies, but to fear itself." Secutor Livia joined them, her robes tattered and smudged with ash, yet her posture resolute. "There are rumors among the survivors," she said, "of comrades who have turned on each other, of whispers guiding men toward paths of betrayal. This is no longer merely a battlefield. It is a crucible, and the enemy, they are patient. They will test us until we break, or until they claim the minds of those we hold dear." Valerius's eyes darkened as he absorbed the reports. Immortality, which had once been a shield against despair, now felt like a lens magnifying every failure, every doubt. He had seen empires rise and fall, but never had he confronted a threat that struck at the essence of trust itself, that turned brother against brother and questioned the very meaning of loyalty. Later, in the council chamber, the tension was nearly tangible. Officers huddled around shattered hololithic maps, their faces pale under the flickering light of emergency lanterns. The Mechanicum envoy observed silently, their presence inscrutable, as though they alone could comprehend the full scope of the threat. Valerius addressed them with deliberate gravity. "We are confronted with forces that defy reason, that twist perception, and exploit doubt. Yet we must not yield. Every choice we make is a weapon, every decision a shield. The enemy's greatest strength is patience, but ours is will. They may test us endlessly, but we endure. We act not only to defend Cadia, but to preserve the truth of loyalty and courage in the hearts of those who remain." Darius's voice trembled as he interjected, "And if we fail, if our men break under the pressure of shadows and whispers?" Valerius's gaze swept across the room, steady and unyielding. "Then we endure still. The measure of courage is not in certainty of victory, but in the refusal to surrender to despair. Even if the outcome is ruin, even if betrayal touches our ranks, we endure, and through endurance, we may yet shape a future worth defending." As night fell over the fractured planet, the first volleys of the external assault began. Warp-tainted vessels streaked across the sky, their forms shifting and writhing, heralding a conflict that was as much cosmic as it was terrestrial. Cadia's defenses, though battered, held firm, and yet the enemy's influence seeped into every shadow, every whisper, every uncertain glance. Valerius moved among the soldiers, offering words of encouragement, silent affirmation, and subtle guidance. Each man and woman he passed bore the strain of endless vigilance, yet in their eyes he saw sparks of determination, flickers of defiance that could ignite a blaze of resistance. These sparks were fragile, yes, but they were hope. And hope, he knew, was the most dangerous weapon the enemy could never truly anticipate. Hours stretched into cycles as battles raged across the perimeters and within the fortress. Cadia's skies were torn with fire and lightning, both natural and warp-born, and the screams of the fallen echoed like a dirge through shattered streets. Yet in the midst of chaos, the internal struggle remained central. Trust was tested, alliances questioned, and even the strongest hearts wavered under the relentless assault of doubt. In a private moment, Valerius confronted the Mechanicum envoy. "How long can we sustain this?" he asked, voice low. "How long before the enemy unravels us from within?" The envoy's response was measured, almost ritualistic. Endurance is not measured in days, but in the persistence of will. Even in the face of the warp's patience, even when shadows seek to claim loyalty, those who remain resolute may yet determine the course of destiny. The choice is not in survival alone, but in the act of defiance. Valerius absorbed the words, feeling their weight settle upon him. The war for Cadia was no longer merely external. It was a test of spirit, morality, and the capacity to endure what seemed unendurable. Every decision, every action, every whispered command would shape the fate of countless lives. As the night deepened, he returned to the ramparts. The warp storm churned, lightning lacing the clouds with unnatural color. Amidst the chaos, he glimpsed movements in the distance, figures advancing with an eerie grace, neither fully mortal nor wholly of the warp. The enemy pressed closer, relentless, patient, knowing that the true victory lay not in death, but in the erosion of trust, in the corruption of the heart. Valerius tightened his grip on the railing, letting resolve harden within him like forged steel. Cadia would endure. He would endure. And even as betrayal, shadows, and the whispers of the warp pressed upon them, they would fight. Not for certain victory, but because resistance itself was the declaration of life, of courage, and of unbroken will against the encroaching darkness. The warp storm had grown into a living tempest, a vast, undulating mass that seemed to breathe with malevolent intelligence. Its tendrils reached across Cadia like the fingers of some ancient, unseen entity, probing, testing, bending the very minds of those who dared oppose it. Commander Valerius Kyle stood upon the shattered ramparts, the ash-laden wind whipping against his armor. Every gust carried whispers, soft, insidious, and nearly imperceptible, that gnawed at certainty and urged doubt into even the steadiest of hearts. Captain Darius approached, his face drawn with the fatigue of endless vigilance. "Outlying squads are reporting changes," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the roar of the storm. Men turning on each other, questioning orders, claiming they see visions of the impossible. Even our most disciplined regiments falter under the weight of it. Valerius nodded, feeling the familiar ache of responsibility. It was not enough to command the body. The mind had become a battlefield as treacherous as any scarred plain or burning city. "The enemy seeks more than blood," he said, voice steady, carrying authority over the chaos. "It seeks certainty of loyalty, the fracture of trust, the erosion of hope. We will not grant them victory so easily." Secutor Livia joined him, robes battered, hands marked with soot and the stains of exertion. "The warp is no longer just an external force," she said. "It infects perception, reshapes thought. What once could be overcome with strategy and courage now demands discipline of spirit. Even the strongest will can falter when faced with its subtle manipulations." Valerius turned his gaze toward the distant horizon, where warped light bent reality and the remnants of Cadia's orbital defenses flickered like dying stars. Immortality had taught him the endurance of time, the patience to outlast fleeting empires, but it hadn't prepared him for this. A war of perception, a battle against whispers that could corrode loyalty and ignite betrayal from within. Later, in the command chamber, he convened a council of his senior officers. Faces pale under flickering emergency lights, They bore the visible marks of sleepless nights, fear, and unending vigilance. The Mechanicum envoy observed silently, inscrutable, as though reading truths beyond the comprehension of mere mortals. "We are being tested in ways no conventional tactic can resolve," Valerius began, voice calm yet resolute. "This is a war not only of arms, but of mind and spirit. Every hesitation, every doubt, every whisper of fear is a potential weapon against us. Yet we endure, not because the outcome is certain, but because our defiance is itself a measure of truth and courage." Darius's voice cut through the tense silence. "And if the men falter completely?" he asked. "If shadows convince them to betray comrades or abandon posts?" Valerius's gaze swept the room with unshakable resolve. "Then we endure still. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Even if we lose, even if betrayal touches our ranks, we hold the line with clarity and purpose. For to surrender to fear is to grant the enemy a victory without contest." As night fell over Cadia's scarred plains, the first true assaults of the external enemy began. Warp-tainted vessels tore across the sky, leaving trails of unnatural light and fire. The fortress shook under bombardment, and the cries of the fallen echoed across the blasted landscape. Yet the internal struggle remained the most perilous. Shadows whispered, visions danced at the edges of perception, and trust frayed among even the most steadfast. Valerius moved among the soldiers, offering words of encouragement, careful correction, and subtle guidance. Every glance, every gesture was a reinforcement against the subtle corrosion of fear and doubt. Each spark of defiance, each act of courage, no matter how small, was a thread in the tapestry of hope. Hours stretched into cycles. Cadia's battered defences held, yet the cost was evident. Reports of apparitions, visions, and internal fractures multiplied. Valerius understood the enemy's ultimate design. Not mere conquest, but complete psychological domination, the conversion of loyalty into suspicion, and the annihilation of unity from within. In a rare quiet moment, Valerius confronted the Mechanicum envoy. "How long can we hold against this?" he asked, voice low. "How long before the whispers unravel everything we've built?" The envoy's response was measured, almost ritualistic. "Endurance is measured not in days, but in the persistence of will. Even when the warp seeks to fracture trust and sow despair, those who remain resolute determine the course of destiny. Survival is insufficient. Defiance is the measure of the worthy." Valerius absorbed the words, feeling their gravity press upon him. The enemy would not relent, nor would the test of loyalty, courage, and clarity cease. Every decision, every order, and every act of resistance mattered, shaping the fate of Cadia, and perhaps the galaxy itself. As the warp storm churned, lightning lacing the clouds with impossible color, Valerius returned to the ramparts. Figures advanced across the plains, neither wholly human nor wholly warp-spawned, pressing with patient, relentless purpose. He gripped the railing, letting resolve solidify within him. Cadia would endure. He would endure. And even as betrayal, shadows, and the whispers of the warp pressed upon them, they would fight, not for assured victory, but because defiance itself, however fragile, was the greatest measure of existence against the encroaching darkness. The storm above Cadia had become a living entity, its fury unrelenting, its intelligence insidious. Commander Valerius Kyle stood on the highest rampart, the ash-laden winds tearing at his cloak, carrying whispers that gnawed at certainty and stoked the embers of fear. The remnants of the once proud fortress lay sprawled beneath him, shattered walls and twisted steel forming jagged scars across the planet's surface. Yet amid ruin, the pulse of defiance persisted, subtle but undeniable, a testament to the indomitable will of Cadia's defenders. Captain Darius approached, the fatigue in his posture barely concealed beneath disciplined restraint. "Reports from the forward outposts are troubling," he said, voice taut with tension. "Men speak of shadows taking shape, of visions that question their loyalty. Some refuse to fight, while others accuse their comrades of collusion with forces unseen." Valerius's eyes narrowed, reflecting both exhaustion and grim resolve. The enemy no longer needed to strike with conventional weapons. It worked subtly, manipulating thought, perception, and trust. "This is no longer a war of steel and fire," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the wind. "It is a war of the mind, and in this, patience and will are our strongest weapons. We endure, not because the outcome is certain, but because our defiance is a beacon in the darkness." Secuta Livia joined him, her robe singed and dust-streaked, yet her presence unwavering. "The warp feeds on doubt," she said. "It amplifies fear, twists perception, and tests loyalty. Even the bravest are vulnerable. Our task is not merely to survive, but to preserve the unity and clarity of those who follow us. That is our strength, and the enemy knows it." Within the command chamber, the council gathered beneath the dim flicker of emergency lighting. Officers' faces were pale and drawn, their features carved by sleepless nights and relentless worry. The Mechanicum envoy moved among them silently, inscrutable observers whose motives and knowledge were known only to themselves. Valerius spoke, his voice deliberate, measured, yet carrying undeniable authority. "We face an adversary that transcends mere corporeal threat. It strikes at trust, at reason, and at the foundation of loyalty. Each hesitation, each shadow of doubt, is a weapon turned against us. Yet our will endures. Every choice, every act of courage, every spark of defiance becomes a shield against its influence. Cadia stands not only on walls and weapons, but on the resolve of its defenders." Darius spoke, voice trembling despite his efforts to remain composed. "And if we falter, if the whispers turn our own soldiers against one another?" Valerius's gaze swept across the chamber, unwavering and resolute. "Then we endure still. Courage is not absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Even in loss, even in betrayal, we act with clarity, resolve, and purpose. To surrender to doubt is to grant the enemy victory without contest. We do not yield." The external assault escalated. Warp-tainted vessels tore across Cadia's skies, leaving trails of unnatural fire, their forms shifting as if alive. Bombardment shook the fortress, yet the internal struggle proved most perilous. Shadows whispered in the minds of soldiers, visions danced at the periphery of perception, and trust frayed dangerously. Every order Valerius issued carried the weight of life and death, but also the weight of loyalty and morale. Amid the chaos, Valerius moved among the ranks, offering guidance, reassurance, and a steady presence. Even the smallest acts, a nod of acknowledgement, a word of encouragement, became critical threads in the tapestry of resistance. Sparks of courage, however fragile, could ignite into determination. And in the face of an enemy that sought to unravel the soul, even a single ember of defiance mattered. Hours passed. The warp storm surged. The battlefield became an arena of both tangible destruction and psychological torment. Reports of apparitions, dissonant visions, and internal fractures multiplied. Valerius understood the enemy's design, not merely conquest, but the total erosion of cohesion, the corruption of trust, and the subversion of the human spirit. In a rare quiet moment, Valerius confronted the Mechanicum envoy. "How long can we hold against this?" he asked, voice low but urgent. "How long before the enemy unravels our very essence?" The envoy's reply was measured, ritualistic. Endurance is measured not in days, but in the persistence of will. Even when shadows threaten to fracture trust and sow despair, those resolute enough to maintain defiance shape the course of destiny. Survival is insufficient. True resistance defines the worthy. Valerius absorbed the words, letting their weight settle within him. The coming hours would demand every ounce of judgment, courage, and endurance. The enemy would press relentlessly, and the test of loyalty and clarity would reach its pinnacle. Every decision, every act of resistance, every flicker of trust would determine the fate of Cadia, and perhaps of the galaxy itself. As he returned to the ramparts, the horizon was torn with unnatural lightning and fire. Figures moved across the plains, neither fully human nor entirely warp-spawned, pressing closer with patient inevitability. Valerius tightened his grip on the railing, resolve hardening like forged steel within him. Cadia would endure. He would endure. Even as shadows, whispers, and betrayals pressed upon them, they would fight, not for certain victory, but because resistance, however frail, was the most profound declaration of life, courage, and unbroken will against the encroaching darkness. The storm above Cadia had become a churning void, alive with malevolent energy that bent reality and whispered impossibilities. Commander Valerius Kyle stood upon the outermost ramparts, the wind tearing at his cloak, carrying ash and the acrid scent of devastation. The planet's surface was scarred beyond recognition, twisted metal and shattered stone forming jagged reminders of centuries of resilience now tested to their limits. Yet, even in the face of this all-consuming darkness, a faint pulse of defiance lingered, a stubborn heartbeat, refusing to yield. Captain Darius approached cautiously, his armor dented and scorched. "Reports from the forward lines are fragmented," he said, voice strained. "Some men have vanished entirely, others fight as though entranced, and whispers continue to erode loyalty. The lines are cracking, Valerius. If we falter now, Cadia falls, not by our enemy's hand, but by the corrosion of fear and doubt." Valerius's eyes hardened as he surveyed the horizon. Immortality had long taught him the patience of endless wars, the endurance of countless empires rising and falling. But never had he faced a threat that struck at perception, trust, and loyalty with such relentless subtlety. "This is the war we were always meant to fight," he said quietly, voice firm. "Not merely against armies, but against despair itself. Even in the shadow of annihilation, we endure, because defiance is itself a weapon." Secuta Livia arrived at his side, robe singed, hands streaked with soot, yet her bearing resolute. "The warp does not merely attack with fire and steel," she said. "It tests the essence of will, twisting loyalty, exploiting fear, and reshaping thought. Even the strongest minds falter, yet every act of steadfastness strengthens our line. Hope is our shield, even if it seems fragile." Within the council chamber, officers gathered beneath the flickering emergency lights, exhaustion etched into every face. The Mechanicum envoy moved among them with deliberate quiet, inscrutable as always, observing the fractures in morale and the subtle corruption of perception. Valerius addressed them with steady authority. "We face a foe that transcends mere physicality. It seeks to unravel us from within, to make loyalty a question and courage a memory. Each hesitation, each flicker of doubt, is a blade turned against our ranks. Yet we endure. Every decision, every act of resistance, every spark of determination becomes a shield. Cadia stands not on walls alone, but on the resolve of its defenders. Darius's voice trembled as he asked the unspoken question. And if the men break entirely, if the whispers and visions succeed in sowing betrayal? Valerius's gaze was unwavering. Then we endure still. Courage is not absence of fear, but the act of standing firm despite it. Even in betrayal, even in loss, we act with purpose. To surrender to despair is to grant the enemy victory without contest. We do not yield. The assault intensified. Warp-touched vessels tore across the sky, fire and unnatural light streaking the heavens. Bombardment shook the fortress to its foundations, while shadows and whispers gnawed at every soldier's resolve. Every order Valerius gave carried the weight of life, loyalty, and the fragile threads of hope that still clung to Cadia's battered soul. Among the soldiers, he moved with deliberate calm, reinforcing morale with a word, a nod, a steady presence. Even the smallest gesture of courage could kindle resistance in the hearts of men. And in this war of mind and spirit, such sparks were more valuable than any weapon. Hours merged into one another, the battle stretching into endless cycles of chaos and vigilance. The warp storm continued its relentless assault, yet the inner struggle remained the true crucible. Reports of visions, apparitions, and internal fractures multiplied, each testing the limits of human endurance. Valerius recognized the enemy's ultimate design, not merely conquest, but annihilation of trust, unity, and the soul itself. In a fleeting moment of quiet, he confronted the Mechanicum envoy. "How long can we sustain this?" he asked, voice low, heavy with the weight of centuries. "How long before the storm unravels us completely?" The envoy's reply was measured, ritualistic. Endurance is not counted in days but in persistence of will. Even when shadows and whispers seek to fracture loyalty and sow despair, those who remain resolute define destiny. Survival alone is not enough. Defiance, even in the face of inevitable loss, is the true measure of the worthy. Valerius absorbed the weight of the words. The enemy would not relent. The trials of loyalty, courage, and clarity would reach their zenith. Every decision, every spark of resistance, every act of defiance would determine the fate of Cadia, and perhaps of the galaxy itself. As he returned to the ramparts, the warp storm churned with impossible colors, lightning tearing across the sky. Figures advanced across the scarred plains, neither fully mortal nor wholly warp-born, pressing onward with patient inevitability. Valerius gripped the railing, resolve crystallizing like tempered steel within him. Cadia would endure. He would endure. And even as betrayal, whispers, and shadows pressed upon them, they would fight, not for certainty of victory, but because defiance itself, however fragile, was the truest measure of life, courage, and unbroken will against the encroaching darkness. The horizon burned, the storm raged, and in the hearts of those who remained, hope flickered. It was small, it was fragile, but it was enough. The skies above Cadia had grown darker than any night Valerius Kyle had witnessed. The warp storm, now a writhing mass of unnatural light and shadow. Its malevolent tendrils stretched across the planet, probing every defensive line, twisting perception, and testing the resolve of those who remained. Commander Valerius Kyle stood upon the shattered battlements, his cloak torn and scorched, the acrid smell of burning metal and ash filling the air. He had long known that survival was not enough. Endurance demanded more, a steadfast heart, an unbroken will, and the courage to act when all seemed lost. Captain Darius approached, his expression grim beneath the grime and fatigue. "The outer garrisons report anomalies," he said quietly. "Men hear voices, shadows move in places they should not, and some refuse orders, claiming they see visions that contradict reality itself. Even our most disciplined units falter under this assault on mind and soul." Valerius's eyes, dark with centuries of experience, swept over the scarred horizon. Immortality had taught him patience, but it hadn't prepared him for the corrosion of trust and certainty. "This war," he said, voice steady yet resonant, "is fought on the battlefield of perception. They aim not only to destroy bodies, but to unravel the very fabric of loyalty and hope. And yet we endure, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because defiance in itself is a weapon." Secutor Livia emerged from the shadows, her robes tattered, hands streaked with soot, yet her bearing resolute. "The warp manipulates reality, preying on fear, twisting loyalty, and amplifying doubt," she said. "Every act of courage, however small, strengthens the line. Every spark of defiance defies the corruption attempting to seep into our minds. That is where our strength lies." Within the command chamber, officers huddled beneath the dim flicker of emergency lights, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and determination. The Mechanicum envoy moved silently among them, inscrutable as always, observing fractures in morale and subtle manipulations of perception. Valerius addressed them, voice carrying a weight of unwavering authority. "We confront an enemy beyond the realm of mere flesh and steel. It seeks to unravel trust, turn loyalty into doubt, and ignite betrayal within our ranks. Every hesitation, every shadow of fear, is a blade against us. Yet we endure. Each choice, each act of resistance, each spark of defiance is a shield. Cadia stands not on walls and weapons alone, but on the courage and resolve of its defenders." Darius's voice trembled. "And if we falter completely? If our own men turn on each other?" Valerius's gaze was unwavering. "Then we endure still. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Even in betrayal, even in loss, we act with purpose and clarity. To surrender to doubt is to grant the enemy victory without contest. We do not yield." Outside, the assault escalated. Warp-touched vessels tore through Cadia's sky, their forms flickering between reality and nightmare. Bombardment shook the fortress to its foundations, and yet the internal struggle proved far more treacherous. Shadows whispered, visions danced, and the bonds of loyalty strained under unseen pressures. Every order Valerius gave carried the weight of life and the fragile threads of unity that still held Cadia together. Amid the chaos, Valerius moved among his soldiers, offering guidance, reassurance, and silent affirmation. Each nod, each word of encouragement, each gesture of steadfastness was critical, a lifeline in the maelstrom of fear and doubt. Even the smallest sparks of courage had the power to ignite determination in those on the verge of collapse. Hours blended into one another as battle raged across the shattered plains. The warp storms surged with relentless intensity, yet the true crucible remained the human spirit. Reports of visions, apparitions, and internal fractures multiplied, testing the limits of endurance. Valerius understood that the enemy's ultimate goal was not merely physical conquest, but annihilation of trust, unity, and hope itself. In a brief moment of quiet, he confronted the Mechanicum envoy. "How long can we resist this?" he asked, voice low, heavy with the weight of countless battles. "How long before the storm destroys us from within?" The envoy's answer was measured, ritualistic. Endurance is not measured in hours or days, but in the persistence of will. Even when shadows and whispers seek to fracture loyalty and erode hope, those resolute enough to remain defiant shape the course of destiny. Survival alone is insufficient. True resistance lies in unwavering defiance. Valerius absorbed the weight of those words. The enemy would not relent. The trials of trust, courage, and clarity would reach their zenith. Every decision, every spark of defiance, every act of courage would determine the fate of Cadia, and perhaps of the galaxy itself. He returned to the ramparts as the warp storm surged violently, lightning tearing through the unnatural sky. Figures advanced across the devastated plains, neither fully mortal nor entirely warp-born, pressing onward with inexorable patience. Valerius gripped the railing, resolve hardening like tempered steel within him. Cadia would endure. He would endure. And even as shadows, whispers, and betrayal pressed upon them, they would fight. Not for assured victory, but because defiance, however fragile, was the truest measure of life, courage, and unbroken will against the encroaching darkness. The warp storm above Cadia had reached a crescendo, a living tempest that pulsed with malevolence, its lightning scarring the sky with unnatural colors that twisted perception and reality alike. Commander Valerius Carl stood upon the ramparts, the ash-laden wind tearing at his cloak, carrying the bitter scent of fire and ruin. Below him, the shattered fortress sprawled across the scarred plains, a testament to centuries of resilience now tested to their limits. Yet, even amid devastation, the faint pulse of defiance lingered, a stubborn heartbeat refusing to yield. Captain Darius approached, every step measured against the roar of the storm. "Reports from the front lines grow more disturbing," he said, his voice strained with exhaustion. "Men vanish, others turn on comrades under the influence of visions, shadows, and whispers. Even our most disciplined soldiers hesitate, paralyzed by doubt." Valerius's gaze swept across the horizon, dark with the churning chaos of the warp. Immortality had granted him patience, endurance, and perspective on the rise and fall of countless empires. Yet nothing had prepared him for this. A foe that struck not with fire and steel, but with perception and loyalty itself. "This war is fought in the mind as much as on the battlefield," he said quietly. "They seek to unravel trust, to ignite betrayal, to erode hope. And yet we endure, not because victory is assured, but because defiance itself is a weapon." Sicuta Livia moved beside him, robes torn and scorched, yet her posture unbroken. "The warp is relentless," she said. "It preys on fear, twists loyalty, and amplifies doubt. Each act of courage, however small, fortifies the line. Even fragile hope becomes a shield against the corruption that seeks to claim us from within." Inside the command chamber, officers huddled beneath the flickering emergency lights, exhaustion and tension etched into every face. The Mechanicum envoy moved silently among them, inscrutable, their presence a reminder that the enemy's influence was vast and subtle, and that the preservation of order required vigilance at every level. Valerius addressed the council with a steady, commanding voice. "We face an enemy beyond mortal comprehension. It seeks to unravel trust, to turn loyalty into doubt, and to ignite betrayal within our ranks. Every hesitation, every flicker of fear, is a weapon aimed at us, yet we endure. Each choice, each act of defiance, each spark of courage is a shield. Cadia stands not on walls or weapons alone, but on the steadfastness of its defenders." Darius's voice trembled. "And if our men falter completely? If the whispers succeed in turning them against one another?" Valerius's gaze was unwavering. Then we endure still. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Even in betrayal, even in loss, we act with purpose. To surrender to despair is to grant the enemy victory without contest. We do not yield. Outside, the external assault escalated. Warp-touched vessels streaked through Cadia's sky, their forms flickering between the real and the impossible. Bombardment shook the fortress to its foundations, while shadows and whispers gnawed at the minds of soldiers. Every order Valerius gave carried the weight of life, of loyalty, and of the fragile threads of hope that still clung to Cadia. Among the troops, he moved with calm precision, offering guidance, reassurance, and presence. Even the smallest gestures, a nod, a word of encouragement, became lifelines in the maelstrom of fear and doubt. Sparks of courage, however fragile, could ignite determination, and in a war of mind and spirit, such sparks were more valuable than any weapon. Hours merged into cycles of ceaseless battle. The warp storm surged, relentless and unyielding. Yet the true test remained the human spirit. Reports of visions, apparitions, and fractures multiplied, pushing soldiers to the brink. Valerius understood the enemy's ultimate goal. Not merely physical conquest, but the annihilation of trust, unity, and hope itself. In a fleeting quiet moment, he confronted the Mechanicum envoy. "How long can we sustain this?" he asked, voice heavy with the weight of countless battles. "How long before the storm unravels everything we hold dear?" The envoy's reply was deliberate, ritualistic. Endurance is measured not in days or hours, but in persistence of will. Even when shadows and whispers seek to fracture trust and erode hope, those who remain resolute shape destiny. Survival is insufficient. True defiance is the measure of the worthy. Valerius absorbed the weight of the words. The enemy would not relent, and the trials of loyalty, courage, and clarity would soon reach their zenith. Every decision, every spark of defiance, every act of resistance would determine the fate of Cadia, and perhaps of the galaxy itself. He returned to the ramparts as the warp storm raged above, lightning tearing through the sky in unnatural hues. Figures moved across the scarred plains, neither fully mortal nor entirely warp-born, pressing forward with patient inevitability. Valerius gripped the railing, resolve hardening like tempered steel. Cadia would endure. He would endure. Even as shadows, whispers, and betrayal pressed upon them, they would fight. Not for assured victory, but because defiance, however fragile, was the truest measure of life, courage, and unbroken will against encroaching darkness. The pulse of resistance continued, fragile yet unbroken, the final test of spirit and loyalty on the edge of annihilation. The air above Cadia vibrated with a tension older than any mortal reckoning. Warp lightning clawed across the sky, shattering clouds into shards of impossible color, and the storm that had haunted the planet for cycles now seemed almost sentient, watching, calculating, waiting. Commander Valerius Cale stood atop the highest tower of the fortress, the wind tearing at his cloak and the stench of ash and ozone clinging to his armor. Every instinct, every sense honed by millennia of command, screamed that this moment was not merely another battle, but the culmination of every choice, every act of courage or hesitation that had led them to the brink. Captain Darius approached, his face drawn with exhaustion and unease. "The front lines. They are faltering," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the roar of the storm. "Men are seeing things, impossible things. Shadows of comrades who are not there, visions of enemies where none exist. Some claim betrayal among their ranks, but we cannot confirm. The line is breaking, Valerius. Valerius' gaze swept across the scarred plains below, where fire and warped reality collided. The enemy does not merely seek to conquer, he said, voice calm but carrying the weight of command. It seeks to unmake us from within. Loyalty, courage, hope. These are as much weapons as guns and cannons. If we falter in spirit, all is lost. Secutor Livia emerged from the smoke-laden shadows, robe scorched, eyes glowing faintly in the unnatural light. The warp seeks more than mere death, she said. It tests our faith, our bonds, our very understanding of reality. One misstep, one doubt, and it can unravel entire legions. You have kept the line intact by your presence alone, Valerius, but now the ultimate trial is upon us. The Mechanicum envoy moved among the council, silent as always, their faceless helm reflecting the chaos around them. Valerius turned to them. How long can Cadia endure this? He asked, voice low, almost a whisper against the screaming wind. Endurance is not measured in days, the envoy replied, their voice modulated, ritualistic, as though each word had been weighed and consecrated. It is measured in the persistence of will. Even when shadows betray, when whispers erode trust, those who remain resolute determine destiny. Survival alone is meaningless. Defiance, even in the face of inevitable loss, is the measure of worth. Beyond the ramparts, the battlefield had become a chaotic theatre of destruction. Warp-touched vessels carved impossible trajectories across the sky. Bombardment shook the ground, and the screaming of men, real and imagined, echoed like a chorus of despair. Yet even in this apocalypse, Valerius's forces endured. Small acts of bravery, moments of steadfast loyalty, and sparks of defiance kept the line from crumbling entirely. Darius's voice cut through the tension. Some of the outer garrisons, they are no longer following orders. They believe the enemy is within us, not outside. They accuse comrades of betrayal. Valerius's eyes narrowed, shadowed by both fatigue and the weight of command. Then we endure still, he said, voice still. Courage is not absence of fear. Loyalty is not blind obedience. Even in betrayal, we act with clarity, with purpose. To surrender to despair is to grant the enemy a victory without contest. We do not yield. From the horizon, a new force emerged, neither wholly mortal nor entirely warp-born, moving with deliberate and chilling intent. Their forms shimmered with unnatural light, and in them, Valerius recognized the culmination of the enemy's machinations. A convergence of fear, illusion, and overwhelming force, designed to break the very heart of Cadia. He turned to Livia. The moment has come. Every choice we make now will echo across the galaxy, not just here. Are we ready to face the full measure of the storm? Her gaze was unwavering. We are as ready as anyone can be, and even if Cadia falls, even if the line breaks, our defiance will echo longer than the enemy imagines. Valerius clenched his fists, feeling the weight of immortality and the bitter knowledge of sacrifice pressing upon him. Every life, every decision, every whisper of loyalty or betrayal led to this moment. The line between salvation and destruction was razor thin, and the next hours would decide the fate not only of Cadia, but of the countless souls depending on its survival. As warp lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the ruined plains and the approaching enemy, Valerius raised his voice, firm and unyielding. Cadia endures. Stand fast, for even in the face of annihilation, our defiance is eternal. Fight, not for certain victory, but for the honor of resistance, for the courage that defines us, and for the light that refuses to be extinguished. The wind howled, the sky cracked with unnatural fury, and the first wave of the final assault descended upon the battered fortress. Shadows danced, visions twisted reality, and betrayal lingered at the edges of perception. But Valerius and those who remained would face it, unbroken, determined, and resolute. The storm had reached its zenith, and the crucible of Cadia's soul was about to be tested like never before. The sky above Cadia had become a tempest of unimaginable fury, a churning maelstrom of warp energy that ripped the heavens asunder. Commander Valerius Cale stood upon the fortress ramparts, the acrid scent of burning metal and ash stinging his senses. Below him, the remnants of Cadia's once proud fortifications stretched across the shattered plains, jagged and broken, yet still defiant. Every surviving soldier, every loyal officer clung to the edges of reason and courage, for they knew the enemy now sought not only their lives, but their very souls. Captain Darius moved beside him, weary, voice tight with tension. "The outer garrisons, they no longer respond as one," he said quietly. "Whispers, visions, suspicions. Many are questioning the loyalty of their own comrades. Some have already turned on each other. If we falter here, all is lost." Valerius's gaze swept across the devastation, his mind calculating, weighing possibilities and outcomes honed by centuries of command. "The enemy does not merely aim to conquer," he said, voice low but firm, carrying the weight of authority. "It seeks to unravel us from within. Fear, doubt, and betrayal are weapons just as lethal as bolter or plasma. Our strength lies not only in our arms, but in our will to endure." Secutor Livia emerged from the shadows, robes tattered and scorched, eyes glowing faintly in the storm-lit night. "The warp does not tire," she said. "It feeds on hesitation, twists perception, and amplifies fear. Each act of courage we commit fortifies those around us, but the trial has reached its zenith. The enemy will push us to the very edge of despair, and some will fall, not by fire, but by the corruption of their own hearts." Within the command chamber, officers huddled beneath the flickering lights, faces drawn with exhaustion and terror. The Mechanicum envoy moved silently among them, faceless and inscrutable, a reminder that the preservation of order demanded vigilance in every detail, every decision, every whispered command. Valerius addressed the council, voice ringing with clarity and unwavering authority. "We face an enemy beyond comprehension. It seeks to unravel loyalty, incite betrayal, and ignite fear that fractures even the strongest bonds. Every hesitation, every faltering heart is a weapon aimed at us, yet we endure. Each choice, each act of defiance, each spark of courage is a shield. Cadia's strength is not in walls or weapons alone. It lies in the steadfastness of its defenders." Darius's voice trembled as he asked the unspoken question. "And if the line breaks, if whispers succeed in turning our own soldiers against each other?" Valerius's gaze was unwavering, shadowed with the bitter knowledge of sacrifice. "Then we endure still. Courage is not the absence of fear. Loyalty is not blind obedience. Even in betrayal, even in loss, we act with purpose. To surrender to despair is to grant the enemy victory without contest. We do not yield." The enemy's final assault descended upon the fortress like a tide of living darkness. Warp-touched figures moved across the plains with horrifying precision, their forms shimmering and distorted, neither entirely mortal nor fully of the warp. The storm raged, fire and energy tearing through the air, yet the internal struggle, the erosion of trust, the testing of loyalty, the gnawing fear, proved the deadliest trial. Valerius moved among the troops, offering calm, steady reassurance. Each gesture, each word of guidance became a lifeline in the chaos. Even the smallest spark of courage had the power to ignite determination in the hearts of men standing on the brink of despair. The battle was no longer solely physical. It was the contest of the mind, the spirit, and the will to resist annihilation. He turned to Livia as the enemy pressed closer. "Every choice now will echo across the galaxy," he said. "Our decisions, our courage, will determine whether Cadia survives, or whether its fall becomes the herald of endless darkness." Her eyes glimmered with determination. "Even if we fall, Valerius, the defiance of those who stand against despair will be remembered. Our courage will outlast death, even if Cadia itself does not." The final wave of assault struck with terrible force. Shadows twisted into impossible forms. Visions of betrayal and fear assaulted the minds of the defenders, and the lines of Cadia trembled. But in the heart of the fortress, Valerius and his closest officers remained steadfast, a bastion of clarity against the storm of chaos. Amid the devastation, a single truth resonated. The fate of Cadia and of the galaxy would be determined not by the strength of weapons alone, but by the courage and loyalty of those who refused to yield. Every act of defiance, every spark of hope, every gesture of unwavering will became a weapon more potent than any bolter, more enduring than any shield. The sky above shattered with warp lightning. The enemy pressed relentlessly, and the crucible of Cadia reached its zenith. Here, in the heart of annihilation, the ultimate test of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice would unfold, and the choices made in this moment would echo through eternity. The remnants of Cadia burned beneath a sky torn asunder by warp lightning, the ground shattered and scarred, strewn with the wreckage of centuries of defiance. Commander Valerius Kyle stood upon the highest remaining rampart, his cloak tattered, armor scorched, and eyes heavy with the weight of what had been lost. The storm above raged with relentless fury, as if the very universe sought to punish those who had dared to resist its darkness. Yet, amidst the chaos, a fragile pulse of defiance lingered, a heartbeat of determination refusing to be snuffed out. Captain Darius approached cautiously, each step careful on the crumbling stone. "The outer lines are gone," he said, voice strained. "Many of our men, fallen, vanished, or turned against us. The fortress itself, it cannot hold. Cadia is broken." Valerius turned, his gaze sweeping over the ruinous plains, blackened by fire and warped by the touch of the warp. "Cadia is more than stone and steel," he said quietly. "It is every choice, every act of defiance, every moment we refuse to bow to fear. Though its walls may fall, the spirit of its defenders endures. That cannot be taken." Secutor Livia joined him, her robe singed and ragged, yet her presence resolute. "The warp has claimed much, Valerius," she said. "Yet in every act of courage, in every spark of hope, we resisted. Even now, as shadows press upon us, there remains defiance. Even in defeat, that defiance speaks louder than any victory the enemy could claim." The Mechanicum envoy moved silently nearby, observing the devastation with inscrutable detachment. "Endurance," they said, voice cold yet resonant, "is measured not by survival alone, but by the persistence of will. Even in final collapse, acts of courage, loyalty, and clarity echo through eternity. Cadia's fall will be remembered not as surrender, but as testament to the spirit that refused to yield." Below, the remnants of the enemy pressed closer, shadows and visions twisting reality. Yet in the eyes of those few who remained, there burned a light of unbroken will. Valerius turned to Darius, his voice firm, carrying the weight of millennia. We have fought not for certainty, not for victory, but for the defiance that defines us. Even in the face of annihilation, we have endured in spirit. That is our triumph. The assault reached its zenith, figures moving across the plains with relentless inevitability. Weapons failed, structures crumbled, and visions sought to fracture loyalty. Yet amidst the ruin, small acts of resistance shone like stars in darkness. A soldier shielding a comrade, a unit holding a choke point against impossible odds, a voice calling courage into the hearts of those around them. Valerius raised his hand, signaling the final charge, not of victory, but of unwavering defiance. "For Cadia," he shouted, voice cutting through the storm. "For those who remain steadfast, stand against the darkness, even if the world itself is lost." The defenders surged forward, not with expectation of triumph, but with the clarity of purpose that only those facing impossible odds can know. Every strike, every act of courage, every spark of hope became a testament to the enduring spirit of Cadia. And then, in the heart of the storm, it was over. The fortress lay in ruin, the plains scorched and twisted. The enemy had prevailed in physical terms, yet they could not claim the hearts, the courage, or the defiance that had defined the defenders. Valerius Kyle, standing amid the devastation, understood the paradox of their victory. Survival was fleeting, but the legacy of resistance was eternal. He turned his gaze skyward, where dying suns bled their final light across the horizon. "Cadia falls," he murmured, voice heavy with sorrow. "But the courage of those who stood will endure. The empire may crumble, the walls may break, yet the spirit of defiance, the refusal to yield, remains. That is the cost and the meaning of immortality in a galaxy of shadows." Secutor Livia stepped beside him. "And so the era ends," she said softly. "But the echo of our defiance will resonate beyond time, beyond worlds, beyond the storm. They may destroy all that is tangible, but they cannot extinguish what is eternal." Valerius closed his eyes, feeling the weight of sacrifice, loss, and the fleeting nature of mortal endeavor. The universe stretched vast and indifferent, yet in this indifference a single truth remained: the courage to resist, even in the face of inevitable collapse, was the measure of true legacy. The dying suns cast their final light across the broken world, the ruins whispering of battles fought, loyalty tested, and the enduring flame of defiance. Cadia was shattered, the empire scarred beyond repair, but in every heart that had refused to yield, the spirit of resistance lived on. And in that reflection, in the silence after the storm, the galaxy understood that even in loss, even in tragedy, the defiance of the brave could never truly die.